Good morning. Now, it's a bit of a shame because the photograph that you've just seen me taking, I can't actually show you the setup now because I've come into some really misty conditions and I wasn't expecting it at all. And it just goes to show, doesn't it? I keep saying it, that you've got to be adaptable when you go out in the landscape and ready to react to what the conditions are in front of you. And it was a good example really of what I wanted to show, but never mind, there is another one right in front of me which I'm going to take as well. And today's video is all about exposure modes. Now, I'm not talking about metering, I'm talking about the modes that you actually set on your camera on how you set up the exposure. Now, if you followed my last series on focusing, this will probably slot in really well with it, because we're going to talk about how we use those different modes that are available as well. And one of them works really well with focusing, and that's aperture priority. And that's the one that we're going to use straight away. Now, let's be clear, I'm not going to talk about every single exposure mode today because there's just far too many of them. And the whole purpose of my videos and the workshops that I run up here in the national park as well isn't to get you working in automatic. It's to do exactly the opposite. It's to get you to the point where you can confidently switch those modes off and start working in the manual modes. So the ones that we're going to concentrate on today are aperture priority, shutter priority, and we're also going to be looking at full manual control as well. And I'm going to set up this picture. It's a little bit difficult because, as you can see, I've got this bank of ferns behind me, so I can't really get you around to show you. So what I'll do is I'll shoot some B-roll of what the scene looks like and put that on the screen, and then we'll talk you through those camera settings and why I'm using the ones that I'm using. So let me crack on with that, and I'll be back in just a second when I've got it set up. I'm sorry, as hard as I try to get you this side of the camera so you can actually see what I'm doing, I just can't get you there. I've tried, trust me. So basically what I'm framing up is some grasses in the frame, and I will take some video through this camera so you can see what my composition looks like as I'm talking about it. It's a very, very simple photograph, and I really do hope it's going to work out well. Because I've had this mist moving through the valley, I've got nothing in the background behind the grasses. So this is just foreground, these seed heads on these grasses and a completely blank background. And I think it looks really quite nice. I'm not sure until I get it home and process it whether this is going to be a black and white picture or a colour picture. But it is a really fine example of where you would want to use aperture priority. So let's talk about aperture priority. So it does exactly what it says on the tin really. When you work in the aperture priority mode, you set the aperture on the camera so that has taken priority and the camera handles everything else. Now, it depends how you set your camera up exactly as to what alters, because you could set automatic ISO so the camera may adjust ISO as well. I tend to leave ISO on manual, and today I've increased it a little bit, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then the camera will set the shutter speed. So what I've decided in this picture, because it's a fairly low depth of field required, and if you don't understand what I mean by that, you really need to watch my video on focusing, then you don't have to worry about what's in the background. All we're worried about is this little foreground bit and these grasses. So I've gone for f8 because it's a good position for the lens to use. It's a good optical performance between f8 and f11. In fact, I think this lens works a little bit better at f11, so I'm going to take some f11 as well. And this is where aperture priority comes into its own, because you can make those kinds of decisions, and when you make them, the camera does the rest for you. Now, I do have to be a little bit careful in these weather conditions because it is very dull, and this is going to need a real fine detail and quality in the image, so I don't want to extend the ISO too far. But the reason I'm having to lift it a little bit is because I do need to give the camera an opportunity to set a high enough shutter speed so these grasses aren't swaying about too much. I could try some with the blurred grasses and just see how that looks, but I actually think I want them sharp, so we'll do a mixture, and I'll put the best ones, or the ones that I feel are best anyway, up on the screen at the end. So the composition that I've set up, originally I wanted to go for like a square crop, but I've actually decided now that I would be better off going for maybe a letterbox. You can probably see in the video how those grasses are swaying and moving quite a bit in the breeze. And that's the problem it's giving me. Partly I just have to wait for the right moment. So the other thing that you can do with aperture priority as well is you can set an exposure compensation, because often hear me talking about bracketing, and that's really important because sometimes we want to make our pictures a little bit lighter than the camera wants to make them, or make them a little bit darker. And often, especially in conditions like today where we've got a very light background, the camera is actually underexposing quite a bit, because it's seeing all of that bright white area and it's going, oh, this must be a really bright scene, and it's actually making things a little bit dark. So I need to dial in plus 1 to 2 stops of compensation. So on the Canon 5D Mark IV, when you start looking at exposure compensation and you use the control wheel on the back, you're adjusting the shutter speed. And it will show at the bottom whether you're a plus stop, minus stop, depending on the manual shutter speed that you dial in. But the aperture remains the same. So if you dial in +1 stop and then adjust the aperture from there, the camera will continue to dial in +1 stop exposure compensation and move the aperture to suit. And we're going to try that in a minute as well. So hopefully that's explained aperture priority to you a little bit. I'm going to finish off taking these photographs, show you my final picture, and then we're going to go and see if we can find something else which works well for manual and very well for shutter priority as well. I'll see you in a minute. So we've all got a number of favourite ways of working, and mine for many years has been working purely in manual. And that's one of the reasons that I started doing this video, really, this series, because I thought I don't use aperture priority and I don't use shutter priority. Well, I use shutter priority sometimes, but mainly when I'm shooting sport or any sort of action photography. But I don't utilise the other functions of the camera, and is there a way that they can help me out and make things easier for me? And the answer to that is obviously a yes, of course there are. But what we're going to do in this picture is I'm going to show you how I use manual mode. I use manual really because once you get to the point that you understand your camera fully and you understand exposure and focusing and everything, the manual's quite easy to use. But it has led me astray sometimes. There are some downsides to it. Sometimes I've altered the wrong dial, and I've found that when I've been doing an exposure bracket and I wanted to keep f11 aperture, for example, I've been changing the aperture by mistake, and then I found that my pictures have been degraded as a result of that. Sometimes I've noticed it in the field and I've been able to correct it. Other times I've gone home and gone, I didn't get what I wanted, and it's because I made a silly mistake. So some of those other modes allow you to get around that. But let's talk about manual and how we're going to do it. So let's have a look at this composition first. You can pretty much see my composition from where you're placed at the moment, but I'll bring you in closer to the back of the camera later on so you can see the changes in the settings that I'm doing. But basically I've got a hawthorn tree, it looks like a hawthorn tree, that's growing at an odd angle. It's probably fallen at some point and just taken root where it is, growing out of the frame. And there's a nice sort of splattering of foxgloves in front of it, adding a little bit of colour. And then in the background, I think it's off your frame actually, to be honest, there's another stronger hawthorn tree in the background, and some rock formations as well up there. Now the sky's a little bit bright, so I'm probably going to have to do some kind of exposure blending to get this picture right, but we'll see what we do when we actually do that in Photoshop. But basically, in terms of manual exposure settings, we'll bring you in closer so you can have a look, and I'll show you how I'm doing it. So different cameras have different ways of working, but basically on my camera the exposure modes are set by using this dial on the top of the camera. And on this one, if you put enough information up on the screen, you can also see in the top corner here as those modes change. So aperture priority, AV, manual priority is just an M on the screen. So I've already set my composition up. Now what we need to remember when we're working with manual exposure is that we are changing down here both the aperture, as you can see it, and also the shutter speed at the same time. Now when we take a meter reading, you'll see that the exposure down the bottom, plus and minus for over and under exposure, changes, and none of these settings are fixed. So if we want to get correct exposure, and correct exposure is normally when that's lined up in the middle, although as I explained before, sometimes you may wish to over or underexpose the image, you have to use these to line it up. So you do need to decide what aperture you want to use. Now I'm going to use f11 for this picture. It's the best one for the lens, and because of the way that the scene is set up, it's going to give me enough depth of field. So I'm focusing on the wall just behind this tree, just behind the fallen tree in the foreground. I've already done that, so I'm quite happy with that. And we're actually going to take a series of exposures, starting at 2 stops over and going to maybe -3 or -1. Now I'll use my cable release as I normally do, so you won't be able to see that in the frame, but I'll just get that plugged in, ready to go. So the first picture, I just mark it as I always do, and we're going to take a bracket of exposures. So I want to set at f11, it's set on f11, plus 2 stops, and then we're going to go +1, and because we've got a third of a stop set on the camera, we've got to move that down 3 times. It's the next one. Then correct exposure, another 3/3 gives me a full stop. And then we're going to go down another to -1, and looking at that we can see that we've got everything in exposed correctly. So that's where we're going to leave that exposure. So let's put this picture up on the frame, on the screen for you, sorry, and we'll see if you like it. The walk down to this location was difficult, shall we say, at least. I actually decided to try and find a new spot, and I went the wrong way and kind of got lost in the woods. But anyway, this is a brand new location for me today, and that's part of the fun of exploring the outdoors, isn't it? You know, getting lost, finding new places, maybe places that other people haven't photographed, so I'm quite happy to be here. I was looking for a waterfall. No doubt you can hear it in the background rushing away, because it's a real good opportunity when you're at a waterfall to use shutter priority, and that's the next thing I want to talk about. Now, it's very, very rare that I use shutter priority in landscape photography, but it may suit some people's style of working. So I'm going to show you it anyway, and then you can decide for yourself. So let's just start with why I don't use shutter priority for landscape photography. Most of the time, what's most important to landscape photographers is focus. It's what's in focus in the frame, the depth of field, the subject. That's what really tends to count. But there are a few occasions, and one of them being water, where you also want to really think about your shutter speeds. Because people like different effects on water. Some people will want water that is frozen really solid and you can see all the action and the drama. Other people like water where you can see no detail at all and it just flows through the scene, and you can't even see any texture in it. And others like something in between, and that's roughly where I am. So when you take this sort of picture where you've got some rapids or waterfalls or moving water, you do need to consider the shutter speed. So the camera's already been put in shutter priority. Now, some cameras you will actually see an S for shutter. On mine it shows TV, which is basically means the same thing, it's shutter priority. So I'm focusing about a third into the image, so we're quite happy with that, where that's focused at the moment. That's fine. Yeah, focused on there, lovely. And then basically what I'm going to do is just use the dial to control the shutter speed, and we'll let the aperture do the same itself. So at f22 we can get 1 second, so let's try that. There's 1 second exposure. We're now going to use the shutter priority again. We'll take it down to ½ a second, and it automatically dropped the aperture to f16 because we're telling it the shutter has priority. And I'm now going to take it down to ¼ of a second. In fact, 1/5 of a second we'll take it down to. And we'll take it down to maybe 1/10 of a second. What we can do then is we can actually go in closer and we can have a look and see which of these pictures we actually like. So once you've decided that you're happy with ½ a second and what that shutter speed is, we're just going to leave that on ½ a second. Now we're getting f20 at ISO 800. I did all my test shots at ISO 800. Now I don't really want to shoot at ISO 800 because it's going to be a little bit noisy. Now that's ideal because 18, 16, 11, I can probably drop it to about ISO 200 with a bit of luck, and that'll work fine for me. So let's take this down to 200 and set that there, and yeah, that's giving me f10. So I'm gonna go with that, and we'll do some brackets anyway. So all we need to do again is just make sure that we're focused, which we are, and take our picture. And there's our finished picture really. ½ a second, f10, and that's how we use our shutter priority to do it. Let me just bracket that, and we'll move from there. And of course, to bracket it, it's going to change the aperture for me, and we can do that by just using the big wheel on the back of my camera, and that'll just change it. So there is 1 stop overexposed at f7.1, keeps the ½ a second. We're going to go down to ½ a second at f10, and then we're going to take it down to -1. Actually, we're not going that far. We're going to go down to f11, -1/3 of a stop, 2/3 of a stop at f13, and at f14 we've got a full stop underexposed, and that should be enough. Well, I hope today's video has given you a kind of an insight into how I actually use the different exposure modes on my camera and what effects you can get with them. As I said before, I haven't covered every single exposure mode you use on your camera because I'm mainly concerned with landscape photography. And the two modes that I use all the time are aperture priority and aperture priority and manual. Now, to be honest, I don't actually use aperture priority as much as I do manual. And I think as a result of doing today's video, I'll probably start using it a bit more. Shutter priority, yes, it's got its uses. I used it today to set the to set the shutter speed that I wanted for this water, but it's still important that you get everything in focus. So if you have a moment of doubt and don't know what to use when you're doing your landscape photography, pick aperture priority, set your camera around f11, and you're going to get fairly sort of like decent results. So that's all I've got to say today. I really do hope that you've enjoyed today's video, and I'm certainly going to see you in the next one. It might be the next one, it might be the one after it, I'm not quite sure, but we're going to be going into looking at your metering modes and how these different patterns of metering can help you out with your photography as well. So until next time, go out, enjoy your own photography. Bye for now.